Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here. It's episode 2666 of The Tom Woods Show, and I'm very glad to have Brian Isted with us today. And I've just recently gotten to know Brian. He's a Canadian. I know I've got a sliver of you out there who are in Canada, who, whenever I complain about things in the U.S., you write to me and say, well, it could be worse. You could be in Canada, but I don't know. There are pluses and minuses of everywhere. But Brian has an interesting background that lends itself to a revisiting of the COVID matter. And I know that I have listeners who understand that even though that happened a few years ago, it's still of lasting significance. Because remember, if we get the story wrong, then the next time they try to pull this, they'll use COVID as justification for the next thing. Well, remember all the lives we saved all those years ago. We got to keep hitting this. You cannot let this thing get out of hand. I mean, it's like the Great Depression in the U.S. Well, we've all been told that was because we had laissez-faire capitalism and we needed to crack some more skulls and we would have prevented the Great Depression. And so then when we have downturns, we say, well, you don't want the Great Depression again, do you? So we have to do X and Y. We just can't let that happen. So I'm really glad to have Brian here with us. Now, Brian, describe for the folks exactly what your background is and why that would have had anything to do with this.
Yes, sir. So thanks for having me on. Real quick about me, I spent about 11 and a half years, almost 12 years in the Canadian military as a junior officer. I joined as an infantry officer in the reserve, moved over to the regular force army, which is what you guys call active duty, I think. So full-time military, moved from the infantry into military policing. And military policing is where I got a deployment to Iraq as a close protection team leader, which is a fancy way of saying a bodyguarding team lead for high-ranking officials and important people in Baghdad. Then I moved into the intelligence side, still as a military police officer, not as an intelligence officer, but doing intelligence work in the cyber realm, which is where I got very unique and interesting exposure to the intelligence community for a couple-year period between 2019 and mid-2020, which was a very interesting time to be working in intelligence as COVID rolled out. And then made my way to special operations community, which I ended up leaving late 2021, and then leaving the military entirely in 2024.
Am I skipping ahead too much in the story to ask what made you leave the military?
No, not at all. So it happened about a year ago. I was medically released from the military with just a plethora of health problems, starting with a fairly significant one being a blood clot. Within about 6 weeks, my second voluntary vaccine that I received in the Canadian military as part of the mandates. So the blood clot was the first thing that rolled into a number of health problems that were enough for them to basically say, hey, do you want to be here anymore? And I said, not really. And it was time to go. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, if we were painting with broad strokes, we would say that in general, the governments of the world responded to COVID in largely similar ways, even though some went to crazier extremes than others. The response of virtually all countries shared a lot in common about their assumptions, the proposed solutions to the problem, the restrictions on the public. Again, they varied from one place to another. Peru and Australia were worse, let's say, than the U.S. or obviously Sweden, but there were other places too that were kind of in the middle.
Canada rivaled Australia for being worst offender reaction.
Yeah, right. I mean, Australia went to an absurd extreme, but you saw the Canadian response up close, and what was interesting to me is that one area where Canada was a little bit more lenient than the U.S. was that it reopened international travel sooner than the U.S. did. Not requiring a vaccine passport. The U.S. hung on to that till the bitter end, that you could not get into the U.S. without this useless document. Canada got rid of that sooner than I would have expected them to. But is there anything particularly unique about the Canadian experience that you saw up close?
Yeah, for sure. I don't even know where to start, but something that jumps out right away is that Quebec borders Ontario on the northeastern corner. So I was living in Ottawa. That's where I was posted to do intelligence when COVID was rolling out 2019, 2021. And Quebec, the province of Quebec, had essentially a curfew and border set up so that you were not legally allowed to cross the border into Quebec unless you were a Quebec resident. And they had police checkpoints set up along the border. This is early in COVID, but this was still quite intense. And at the time, I had a girlfriend living in Quebec. So I had to show my military ID just to drive to Quebec, which is a 5-minute drive from my house because I lived right on the border there, just to go and see my girlfriend. And it was just a complete, obviously, flinch and overreaction, which is something probably a lot of people don't know. And then miraculously, the curfew and all the restrictions were lifted, just sort of arbitrarily when the pushback from the citizens had reached a point of, I think, where people were going to start rioting, and then all of a sudden COVID went away and it was safe to be out after 10 again. It was a huge coincidence that all happened at the same time. But that was one thing that I think people really need to keep in mind moving forward, because that was pretty scary and Orwellian.
As you know, I have a book on this, Diary of a Psychosis. And one of the things that I think about it that's valuable is that even I, as somebody who followed this very closely and wrote about it on a regular basis, even I have forgotten, some of the details of all the craziness. I mean, my county had a completely useless and pointless curfew. And, I couldn't move between one property and another after a certain hour. And it was, and none of it made sense. It was all arbitrary, as they will more or less concede to you now. But they'll say, well, what do you expect us to do? We couldn't possibly have known. But they're saying that they couldn't possibly have known long, long after people did know. Like anybody with a brain knew. And this sort of thing just kept on going on. And I kept looking at, I have to say, Justin Trudeau. It was crazy enough watching what was going on in the U.S., but geez, with Justin Trudeau, I thought, is Canada ever going to have normality again? Is it ever? I mean, he was like Gavin Newsom, who had these tears, these reopening tears. And if you look at the metrics that would have to be met for California to reopen fully, it would never reopen fully. Because even just the false positives on the test would be enough to keep the state from reopening fully. And then eventually it got to a point where he decided, well, can't do this forever. And he just reopened it and totally ignored those numbers.
Well, he was trusting the science, from what I remember.
Oh, geez, for crying out loud. I mean, how can anybody repeat any of these slogans without snickering, ever again?
Yeah, it's pretty cringy just to even hear the name Trudeau still. A little PTSD from that.
Well, and it's interesting that in Canada, there are some references to Canada in my book, and one of them has to do with when they rolled out the shots, and then they started restricting people's activities if they hadn't gotten the shots. The way that was sold most of the time in the U.S. was, this is to keep you all safe. We got to keep you safe from the unvaccinated people. But from time to time, you'd get a Canadian official who was more honest, who would say, this isn't about keeping anybody safe. It's about behavior modification. It's about making your life miserable if you don't get the shot, so that you'll change your stubborn attitude and go out and get the shot. I mean, in a way, there's a perverse sense in which that's refreshing. At least they're telling me what the point of this craziness is.
I think that happened pretty late in the game, but yeah, the truth started to trickle out.
Yeah. So I was lucky because, I've lived in Florida since 2016. So that was purely fortuitous. I had no idea when we moved here that there would be a really, really good reason for being here. So I have 5 kids, and they were able to more or less live as normal. I didn't have to put them through like a life is beautiful situation where I had to pretend that it was all a game. They didn't really see all that much craziness apart from the odd masking here and there. They were able to live. They didn't have big milestones in their lives just abruptly canceled. They didn't have their hearts broken because irreplaceable memories were permanently taken from them, you know? But I don't know what it was like to live in Canada. Were all the provinces about the same, or were some of them even more unreasonable than others?
Like I said, Quebec had the most extreme reaction
Yeah.
with the curfews. Ontario wasn't too far behind. I think the only province that was slightly less crazy was Alberta, which is kind of like the Texas of Canada, where people are, I don't know, they feel and seem to act a little bit more free there. A bunch of my friends have since left Eastern Canada and Ontario to head out to Alberta. They live out there now and they love it. But more or less, we were across the board turned into East Germany for 2 years.
Hey, everybody, I know a lot of you care about your blood work. Maybe you're monitoring health issues that run in your family. You just like to avoid the doctor, or you just want to have peace of mind. Well, to help get those results we want, there's one simple lifestyle upgrade all of us can make, and it's super easy. It's called Field of Greens. Enjoy a delicious glass of doctor-formulated Field of Greens each day. I personally drink the lemon lime. I drink lemon lime everything, pretty much. Not only will you feel great, but your doctor will notice your improved health or your money back. People are writing to Field of Greens and saying things like, the best blood work I've had in a decade. My doctor said, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Or the mom who said, after Field of Greens, my hair, my nails, my energy, and blood work are all better. And that seems like crazy good results for a fruit and vegetable drink. So how do they do it? Well, each fruit and vegetable in Field of Greens was selected with the specific aim in mind to support vital organs like heart, liver, kidneys, metabolism, and the immune system, and healthy blood cells. And you can count on Old Woods for a discount, so let me get you started with 20% off and free shipping. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use code WOODS. That's fieldofgreens.com, code WOODS. What was actually going on in some of these top secret briefings, with the government with regard to senior officials and COVID policy?
Great question. So do you want me to get into the timeline a little bit? Because I think it makes sense.
Yes, I want the whole thing.
So and forgive me, anybody who's watched me before, not like anybody cares about me, but in case you have, I'm going to repeat some things. So in the fall of 2019, there was the World Military Games in Wuhan, China. And a lot of people don't know that still somehow. So a handful of my friends attended these events. I think there was over 100 countries represented there. A lot of militaries showed up to play soccer and volleyball and archery or whatever people do. I wasn't there. But so just for in terms of chronologically, this is important. So in October of 2019, hundreds of countries, thousands of soldiers were represented in Wuhan, China, where they started returning late October, being quarantined on flights on the way back. So because of how sick they were. And there's reporting of this that was tried to be buried, and some savvy folks reached out and dug it up and exploited it. But going back to 2019 in the fall, I think personally, based on the intelligence that appeared in early 2020, this pandemic had already started, or pandemic in quotes. So whatever was going on in Wuhan, and I'm not saying that this was released intentionally by China to infect all of the militaries of the world at once. But if I was going to release a bioweapon and I wanted it to get spread far and fast, that's probably what I would do. Anyway, with that being said as a caveat, I think it's very likely that this pandemic started spreading in late October of 2019. So fast forward to early 2020, I've returned from some traveling. I was in Northern Australia for much of that. And let me tell you, there's a lot of Chinese tourists in Northern Australia. So if I was going to get COVID, I probably already had it up there. But I returned back to Canada in Ontario about mid-January. And by then, open source information in terms of legacy media had been talking about it quite a bit. Like the fear campaign had ramped up full speed. I had been basically completely disconnected of it as I was traveling up and down the coast of Australia until I got back. So now I'm back in intelligence. I'm getting the briefings. It's now early to mid-January, and the intelligence community is fully spooled up over what's going on, and they want to know everything about COVID. COVID is the top subject of every meeting and every email, and they really are trying to figure out what's going on. And between sort of mid-January to, I'll fast forward all the way to 2 weeks to flatten the curve in mid-March, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the leadership, whether they are federal, provincial, municipal, military, whatever leadership, that an overreaction at that point arguably was still probably better than an underreaction. So if they were going to overreact to what they didn't have the 100% solution on what this was, at least for 2 weeks, that would probably be better than not doing anything at all, and the optics of that and the potential fallout of that. So somewhere between January and March, my file was cyber. So every day for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you use level 3 to an open source network. So top secret, and regular kind of networks that you can just get open source information, which means it's available to anyone, which is actually a very useful tool if you know where to look and you've been trained on how to use them. My job was to scour the internet for cyber information, cyber intelligence and information as it relates to the allies in the Five Eye community. So that's Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Those are the Five Eyes of sharing intelligence. So those are the most important sort of realms that you look into in terms of finding information and being able to share it between the five of us. So at some point in that, I don't remember exactly when, my chain of command sat our team down and said, look, whatever you're working on, stop working on it. In terms of, for me, it was cyber, and we need to figure out what's going on with COVID. So dive into COVID, help your teammates out, whatever you find, send it up if it's worth sending. So for several months, this is what I did. Like, we sat in front of computers and I looked into all the open source, the secret, the top secret reporting, what was being on the networks, what the chatter was, how serious was this, how far was it going to go, how fast was it going to go, and all that stuff. And again, I will give the benefit of the doubt, saying that I'm not really sure that anybody kind of knew what was going on up until about March, April. But after that first 2 weeks, and like your book very obviously demonstrates, as of April in 2020, there was a lot of data coming back about places that had locked down severely, places that hadn't, what the responses were based on the severity of the lockdown or lack thereof, it, or masking or not, and all the nonsense that we went through for a few years. There was a lot of data that existed between March and when I left in July. And when you spend all day looking at it for 8 hours a day, you start to develop this understanding of it. This probably is nowhere near as bad as we're being told it is for some reason. And I don't understand, at least I'm speaking for myself, I didn't understand why we kept extending 2 weeks to a month to 2 months to 6 months. And to circle back to your original question, what was going on in these briefings? Because we were at such a skeleton crew of people, because if you had more than one person in from your team, everyone's going to die of COVID. So I became kind of the de facto team lead, even though I was a very junior person in the environment. I still had a thirst for knowledge, and I worked around some very intelligent people that I was very fortunate to spend time with and learn from. So I liked being there, and I wanted to learn and contribute. But given that I was the only person there on many occasions, I got the chance to sit in on these very senior meetings where the briefings going up from the medical intelligence teams was basically a regurgitation of what you saw on CNN. So it was inaccurate modeling, doomsday fear mongering, just everything that you would see on what we have. The equivalent of CNN up here is called CBC, and it's just unbelievable propaganda propped up from government funding broadcasting. But it was nonstop fear. But referencing again your book, having read it afterward, obviously, but looking back at all the data that I was seeing in real time that occurs in your book, it didn't make any sense to me. And I'm sitting in these briefings being probably the dumbest person in the room, in terms of, I have a rocket scientist to my left who briefs on Chinese or Russian, rocket capabilities, and I've got a PhD and an MD to my right, and everything in between. And I'm sitting in this room hearing these briefings of just spreading fear and models that don't make sense. And I just kept feeling like I was missing something. And with the gift of hindsight, obviously, now it just seems like lazy reporting. In the last podcast I did, a friend of mine reached out afterward to tell me, hey man, like, these folks actually were working quite a bit. Don't get it confused that some of the medical intelligence people weren't showing up to work, because they definitely were. But in my mind, that seems even lazier now, that these people actually did come into work every day and were not able to contribute anything of any real value. It seemed like all they did was just report what was going on in CNN. pretty striking.
Okay, so they're pushing the standard line that we heard over and over. I always wondered, how do these people respond when it's pointed out to them, but this country is just going as normal, or this part of the United States is going as normal? I mean, when all was said and done, Florida ended up having better all-cause mortality data than California, which is impossible if the standard story were correct. That's impossible. Florida had better numbers than California. No one would have predicted that on the hysterical side.
And given the elderly population of retirees down there, that's even more wild.
Yeah, but we correct for that.
Yeah.
It's still, it's astonishing that anybody would that people weren't required to at least answer for that. I mean, very, very rare, even in the U.S., for the media to ask people, why are we seeing these oddball results that we shouldn't be seeing if what you're telling us is true? If we had a real media in the U.S., those questions would have been asked a lot more frequently, but they were asked a couple of times, and the answers were terrible. So did anybody even bother in any of these briefings? Did anybody even bother to say, well, hold on to a cotton picking minute here. They're not all dead at the side of the road in Florida, so something's screwy.
Yeah, great point. So again, sitting in these meetings and being the lowest ranking person there, not even really belonging there, not being an intelligence person by trade, I questioned whether what I was seeing was my own bias or interpretation of something that could have been wrong. And I really wanted, and again, I was volunteering and I wanted to come into work and I wanted to use the gym, and I eventually got caught sneaking into the gym, and that was a whole other thing. But it was like, people just seemed to benefit from not going to work. And the people that were making decisions on locking down never missed a paycheck. So they didn't really have any incentive to ever question the choices that were, we need to make sure that everybody's locked up for good, you know what I mean? And working from home in perpetuity, because I'm going to get my incremental raise and I'm not expected to do anything for it anyway. But to answer your question, I had conversations with people sort of around the water cooler, or maybe outside of work even, and not inside of a skiff, just asking straight up questions like of senior people, like people that were much more senior than me, had been there a lot longer, and they're friends of mine and colleagues of mine. And I remember having these conversations saying, why are we doing this? This seems like an insane overreaction. And them straight up saying to me off the record, yeah, it's a complete overreaction, but this is what's being done, and we kind of have to go along with it. And again, how much of that is because the Americans did it, because the UK did it, because Australians did it, or whatever, and just monkey see, monkey do, versus straight up benefiting from the lockdowns? Because if now you get more time at the cottage, more time with your kids, like, I kind of understand why people just didn't question it. It was just self-serving.
All right, so now let's get to the shots. So I assume they threatened you with your career if you didn't take them?
Yeah, more or less. So spring 2021, I did the Canadian equivalent of Hell Week, which is a 10-day long job interview for our Tier 1 Special Forces, which I successfully completed. And then just completing it doesn't mean that you get picked up. But if you get picked up and they offer you a job, they send you what's called joining instructions. So you get this 10-page document that has a list of instructions of where to be and when and what to bring with you. And one of the instructions was, you will be fully vaccinated before you arrive to training in July. So this would have been, I guess, mid-June-ish by the time that the paperwork showed up. So I called the administrators of this paperwork and I said, this is a pretty tight timeline. I don't have any shots yet. I hadn't gotten any shots because I didn't think I needed them. I wasn't telling other people not to get them. I just didn't think I needed them and I didn't want to get them. So up until halfway through the year, it was mid-June or so, I hadn't received anything. When I called them and said, do I really need to get this? They said, well, do you want to work at Dwyer Hill? And I said, yes, I do. So then you're going to show up here with one. And then when you get your, we'll figure it out. So fast forward a few weeks later, I got my first shot that day or the next day at a med tent in Ottawa on one of the bases here. And then a few weeks later, they literally called us out and said, who here doesn't have it? Only me and one other guy put our hand up in a room of dozens of people, of these guys that are all new at the unit. So I went and got my second shot. And that night I just had crazy every side effect that you can think of that's listed with this shot: fever, chills, shaking, sweating, just feeling like I had a super bad flu almost immediately after getting it. I didn't sleep at all that night, and then had to be at work bright and early the next morning for more briefings on sort of our in-doc period. And then almost right away after this second shot, I don't remember feeling anything really from my first one other than maybe a sore deltoid for a day or two. Um, Almost right away after this second shot, I started experiencing super extreme levels of fatigue. It's a very fast-paced environment, don't get me wrong. You're on ranges sometimes 10, 12 hours a day, and it was midsummer, so it's 30 plus degrees. You're wearing 40 pounds of gear. You're firing guns all day, every day. It's hard on the body and it's exhausting. But I couldn't. I was having a real hard time getting out of bed. Lower back pain was just ramping up, and that's a side effect of this kind of training. But having been in the best shape of my life just 2 months prior to complete this very demanding physical, psychological assessment over the span of 10 days, I felt like I was prepared for it, but I just couldn't manage to keep up. And if we fast forward a few months into training now, in my right leg, I start developing this pain at the top of my calf, sort of just behind and underneath my knee. I chalked it up to being in the field for many weeks already, and the demand, the sort of the operational tempo of the training was quite high, and it was fun, but it was exhausting. And basically demonstrating a bunch of deficiencies in training, I had to go speak with the senior leadership. They said that this isn't your year. Like we're sort of pulling you off. We're sort of pulling you off of training for now. I got sent home, and by the time I got home, I think it was within a day or two, the pain in my right leg was so severe that I sort of hobbled into the emergency, the military hospital emergency, where they ran it was hard to stand up and I could barely walk. So I wasn't sure what was going on. They rushed me to an ultrasound, which revealed a 6 centimeter blood clot in my right leg, which is not a very common thing for elite athletes to have in sort of the prime of their life. So they immediately put me on blood thinners, and I was told that I'm going to be on bed rest for a number of weeks and I'm not going into work anymore, and to sort of just wait this out. And anytime I started asking questions about what this could be related to, I was basically told to stop asking questions and take the blood thinners and shut up, basically, and stay home.
So since then, so how has your health improved? Have you gotten over all this, or what? Are you still dealing with it?
So the blood clots, after being on the medication for, I believe it was 6 weeks or maybe 8 weeks of being on warfarin or something of that nature, they put me on blood clots. They re-ultrasounded me, and the blood clot had mostly dissolved, so it had gone away. And the ultrasounds that I've received since then shows it hasn't reformed. But so that was in 2021 when I went home. If we fast forward all the way to 2022, with the back pain that I'd been experiencing that summer had gotten sort of out of control to the point of where now I'm waking up almost nauseous from how much pain I'm in my back. I bought a new mattress. I started stretching more, yoga. I did everything I could think of to try to relieve the stress on my back that wasn't working. Doing any kind of exercise became almost intolerable. So they did some imaging and blood work, which revealed that I now was diagnosed with a incurable autoimmune disorder, which is attacking my spine, where my spine is trying to fuse itself into a rigid shaft, which starts in your low back, which is a disease called ankylosing spondylitis. So that's something I now have that I had no idea. I've never even heard of it. It's a bit of a mouthful to even say, but it ends up being quite painful and require a number of
permanent condition.
Yeah, it's incurable. Yeah. So it's an autoimmune condition. And when I started digging, and again, I'm connecting dots here a little bit, but it's important to notice, if anyone's curious, like start looking into how many autoimmune conditions started flaring up around the time of mRNA technology being introduced. It's quite striking. And when I started asking questions about that, I was told, stay off Facebook by a doctor. I don't have Facebook. I've never had Facebook, but it's like nobody ever wanted to have a conversation about where this could have come from, regardless of how many studies I showed them or sort of intelligent questions I asked them. I was always told to just shut up and toe the line, and I got to stay home from work. So I'm benefiting from this, and it just makes me sick to think about. But to answer your question, when they did my release medical, so now I have this rheumatoid condition in my spine, a history of blood clots, And when they did my exit medical, they hooked me up to an ECG, which measures your heart rate and rhythm. I had irregular heartbeat to the point of where I now have to see a cardiologist, and I had to wear a heart monitor thing that had a bunch of straps hooked up to me for a number of weeks, which was a nightmare to sleep with. But yeah, they've detected some kind of anomaly in my heart rate and rhythm now that they can't figure out.
I mean, now look, just looking at you, you look like a guy who's in reasonably good physical condition. How does this limit your physical activity in some way?
Yeah, the back pain is nonstop. I've developed a number of sort of mitigation strategies through diet, exercise, stretching, physiotherapy, all stuff that I've been aligned with thanks to the military on my way out. When you get a medical release, they do. I should say some good things about the military because I said a lot of inflammatory things, but if you get released medically, they do sort of set you up with a sort of red carpet rolls out in front of you to get access to the resources that you need to be better, hopefully. So I've used everything in the toolbox. I quit drinking entirely. There's a number of inflammation markers that happen from consumption of alcohol. So I completely quit doing that. I don't do it at all anymore. And again, yeah, like diet, exercise, getting enough sleep, not doing things that aggravate it. I can still take care of myself to a reasonably good degree, nowhere near the 5-minute mile times kind of stuff that I'd achieved, running when I was training for selection. But I can still take care of myself. It just takes it's like a full-time job at this point.
Oh my gosh. All right. Well, do you feel like the doctors you talk to are they sympathetic, or do they? I have a funny feeling that sometimes they might be kind of annoyed at vaccine injuries because you're getting in the way of our, the narrative we're trying to put forward here. You're an inconvenience to us.
So I've had so many conversations with doctors since my second diagnosis of the rheumatism in 2022. I guess coming up on 3 years now this fall. I've had so many conversations with doctors, and the conversations you have and the directions they go dramatically depend on the individual physician and what they're willing to say. I had one doctor confide to me, and I'll never say his name, I would never burn him, but he confessed to me that a specialist that I saw, an infectious disease specialist that I saw that was frontline during COVID, knew exactly what was going on, treated thousands of patients in the busiest hospital in Canada. And he had gone on record as saying that we needed to reopen because the damage being done by lockdowns was far worse than what he was seeing in the ER. And this, if anyone knows what they're talking about, it's this gentleman. And he confessed to me in confidence that his life had been threatened for saying this publicly. And he said, please do not repeat that I said that. Like, I don't need any more flack than I've already received. And I promised him I wouldn't. But at the end of the day, I had a handful of other doctors tell me they've seen a bunch of fishy stuff. Some told me to stay off Facebook. Like, it completely depends on who you get to see and sort of what their, I guess, motivation is. I had another doctor in the military tell me that what was going on with me, I should be speaking out publicly. And I said, would you join me? And she said, absolutely not. Like, this could affect my career, my pension, my family. I can't do that. And I totally get it. But at the end of the day, somebody needs to say something to try to shed some light on this. And I'm happy to be the person to do it because I've got time. So the docs are mostly sort of, I think, just protecting themselves rather than protecting any kind of narrative. They're just worried about what's going to happen to their career.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. What can you tell us that we might not know about that trucker convoy that we all heard about in the US that was protesting all this?
So because I worked in intelligence and I received training on how to find information and find patterns, in early 2023, I was alerted to the fact that a tail number of a plane had been spotted flying over the convoy 5 times that was identified as a military spy craft. So this is an airplane. It's called a King Air. This plane is equipped with super advanced data scraping technology. So imagine something flying up in the sky over top of the convoy that can ping every phone on the ground, steal the information from that phone. So we're talking messages, photos, videos, and anything that's in that phone, banking information. If it exists in that phone, they can now harvest it and scrape it. So 5 times this plane flew over top of the convoy in Canada so this is technically a domestic operation of Canadian Special Forces soldiers on civilians in Canada, which is a huge no-no in terms of legality and ethically. And when I dug into finding out what was going on with this, again, having an intelligence background, I found email traffic through ATIP, which is similar to your FOIA. So if you request information, they have to provide it to you within 30 days. It took them about a year and a half, but I got the email traffic that showed that originally a savvy journalist had requested information on why this tail number had been recognized as being a Canadian military plane, and they denied having done it at all. Eventually, they pushed back and said, we need to know why you were there. We know it was you. And the traffic spun it around and pivoted to say, oh, we were just doing a training operation, nothing to see here type of thing. But as soon as they lied about it in the beginning, which I have proof of in the documents and I can show the receipts, it makes me question what was actually going on there. And I think they used troops in Canada on civilians, which is highly unethical and unlawful. And the people that were responsible for this should come forward and say something because it's disgusting.
Hey, everybody, if you're worried, and you should be, about the value of your hard-earned savings getting eaten away by inflation, trade wars, or reckless Fed policy, it's time to secure and grow your wealth in something they can't inflate away, and that's gold. But a lot of gold owners just buy gold and then let it sit there collecting dust, and then they feel like they're missing out on the growth happening in other asset classes. That's why I lease my gold with Monetary Metals. I can earn a 4% annual yield paid in gold every single month while still owning my ounces. Again, the yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold during the year, which, as you know, continues to break all-time highs in 2025. So join me and thousands of happy clients who are earning a gold income every single month. This is a no-brainer for those looking to earn an honest return in honest money. The Fed can print dollars, they can't print gold. Now's the time for you to start growing your wealth in ounces. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. Now look, I know there's no point in pointing out that people like Justin Trudeau are inconsistent and have double standards. Like what could be more obvious than that? But it is interesting to see the kinds of protests that they cheer on, and they take the opportunity to remind people of the importance of protest in expressing the mood of the population. But my goodness, when it's an unapproved topic, then these are the worst troublemakers in the world, and they need to be demonized and condemned, and even potentially have these unlawful measures used against them.
Well, you could gather for a BLM protest in the most densely populated parts of the city among other hundreds or thousands of other people without wearing masks, and that was fine. But if you were protesting the fact that you'd been locked down for 2 years and you were trying to have a conversation with Justin Trudeau about it, you were labeled a right-wing extremist and basically a terrorist, which gives these intelligence and law enforcement apparatus all the opportunity and means to go in and start harvesting everything because they're using backdoor channels to do it via right-wing extremism. There is a lot of information on this that can be found that I've looked at that is very scary and dystopian, what's going on up here. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it because I don't think a lot of Americans are paying attention.
Well, what I fear even more is that I don't think a lot of Canadians are paying attention.
Yes, exactly.
Because can you, for those of us who follow Canadian politics only sporadically, can you fill us in on what we should conclude from the recent election in Canada?
Oh, this is painful. So we just installed basically Justin Trudeau 2.0, except with more aggressive spending and less fiscal responsibility, if you can even fathom that. So the deficit's expected to run into the hundreds of billions now because we're just promising everything with money that just appears as if from nowhere and the printing machine will turn on. And Mark Carney, this recent elected official, basically ran on the policy of we need to defeat the bad orange man down south and scared all the boomers into some kind of elbows up weird slogan that they said that we're going to use to defeat the U.S. hegemony of taking over Canada, 51st state, all that nonsense that was used for marketing. It was quite sad.
Now, look, I didn't know anything about Australia really in terms of politics until COVID. And my impression was that Australia was a very middle of the road kind of society in that, because I have several friends over there who all say that the temperament of the Australian people is that they tend, although they're going to lean left, they tend not to swing to extremes. They don't want to rock the boat. And so you know the result is that you get a kind of predictable center left kind of society, and that's the end of it. But when you have a society that almost revels in not rocking the boat, well, sometimes when the boat really needs to be rocked, nobody's there to rock it. And likewise with Canada, you know, I mean, I guess I kind of had a sense of the political leanings of Canada, but I can't say that I would have known for certain that if something like COVID occurred, that Canada would have behaved this way. Now, you live in Canada. Was any of this a surprise to you?
Great question. I want to say no, but it's when it kept going on and on and on, and the number of people that I worked with, especially because since I am only speaking of that time for that between sort of 2019 and 2022. The number of people that I hung out with were mostly military people because Ottawa's not a huge place, and at least I ended up in these little cliques of people that I spend most of my time with. And the number of people that started just regurgitating the narratives and being fond of what was going on and sort of almost promoting it became quite scary. I've lost a number of friends over it and colleagues and people that I just have no ambition to speak to or spend any time with just because of how sort of blindly they just followed everything. And yes, as a military member and as a soldier, you're supposed to follow orders, but you're also supposed to question orders if they're unlawful. And there's no obligation to follow an unlawful order as per the National Defence Act, which is what the law that governs the Canadian military. So when you're given orders that don't make sense, potentially unlawful and harmful, you do not need to follow that. And at minimum, you question.
But Brian, I would say the problem with that would be who gets to decide whether it's unlawful or not, because the Canadian regime could turn around and say, well, we've examined it and we've concluded that it was lawful, and therefore you were in the wrong.
Yeah, that's so. In the essence of transparency, I'm involved right now in a lawsuit against the Canadian military for the vaccine mandates. So myself and 300 plus other people are involved in a mass tort against the Canadian government and Canadian military to shed some light on why they made the decisions for the mandates and put forward this unlawful order. And when looking at the evidence and all the briefing notes and emails and memos that were sent to the sitting CDS at the time, so the CDS is the Chief of Defense Staff. He's the highest ranking Canadian military officer. He's basically a politician who works for the Minister of National Defense, who works for the Prime Minister at the time was Trudeau. So you have someone essentially basically just trying to please his boss by putting forward this unlawful mandate, and that there's we could do another 4-hour podcast on how much evidence there is that shows that despite how many briefings he was given, that this is not the right direction to go, including from a Surgeon General of the military at the time, saying, we do not recommend you do this. He did it anyway. So this was, in my opinion, blatant pandering from a sycophant who just wanted to line up a role after he'd completed his tenure of CDS to roll into NATO or the UN or some other Gucci position. And we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
Well, I wish you the best in that. I hope you managed to triumph there. Before we started to record, I asked if you yourself had a social media account or a website that you might want to make mention of at the end, and you told me that you didn't, but that you nevertheless do want to mention a site that's operated by a friend of yours that does a worthy thing, and I'd like to give you a chance to do that.
So I'm just going to click on the copy here, just so I don't. The last podcast I went on, I screwed up the name of it, and I don't want to be a goon and do that again. So I'm just going to.
Okay.
Am I still there? Did you lose me?
No, you're there.
Okay, so I'm just going to read the copy because a friend of mine named Aaron Dale, he's a Toronto police officer. Him and his colleagues have been running an amazing sort of outreach and training program called the Military Veteran Wellness Program. So they provide important enhanced support for military veterans and increased training and awareness opportunities for law enforcement to assist veterans in crisis. So this program started in Toronto and now has spread to Ontario and across Canada and many other countries across the world, where they are training frontline officers to help to better understand and help a veteran when showing up to someone in crisis as a first responder. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the veteran gets off scot-free and doesn't go to jail. What it does do is it equips these officers with more tools in their toolbox to handle perhaps a very well-trained person or a very well-armed person that might be going through some PTSD or something else. I have no idea what their exposure or experiences were. But right now they've been traveling all over the North America and the world and training these police agencies to help handle this and recognize signs and symptoms and better react to it. So I couldn't be more proud of these guys. And I think what they're doing is really important. And I try to give them a shout out every chance I get.
All right. So what's the website?
It's called the Military Veterans Wellness Program. It's run through the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. There's the website is at oacp.ca. Or you can just Google Military Veterans Wellness Program and it'll come up with a bunch of information. It'll show the copy that I just read. And if you're an administrator of some law enforcement agency and you think this is interesting, definitely find Aaron Dale and give them a shout out, because I just really like what these guys are doing and I have a lot of respect for them.
All right. I'll make sure that's up at tomwoods.com/2666 and in the video description.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, thank you, Brian, for just sharing some insights from the country most of us listening to the show do not inhabit. But, I think it's fair to say normal person in America views Canada with goodwill and wants the normal people in Canada to have, a good life the same way you guys wish that for us, despite all the travails and insanity going on all the time. And, I can't believe the SOBs did that to you, but I appreciate your spirit of determination, just carrying on and fighting for what's right and living the best life you can. So thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
Just a reminder for everybody listening, we're celebrating Ron Paul's 90th birthday at a big barbecue in Lake Jackson that's indoors, so you don't have to sweat your you-know-what off. But a lot of us you're going to recognize from the old Ron Paul Revolution days will be there, and I hope you'll join us. RonPaulBBQ.com is the website, and I'll see you there. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.